Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
A rare clash between Moscow and Western militaries played out in the skies over Poland. As more than a dozen Russian drones entered Polish airspace, NATO fighter jets scrambled to shoot them down. The infiltration prompting Poland's government to invoke Article 4 of the NATO treaty, a rarely used tool triggered when a member is under threat. The drone incursion is just the latest in repeated Russian violations of Allied airspace, leaving Western officials with few doubts the Kremlin is testing NATO's resolve. I'm Caryn Ceolin, and today on The Big Story, I'm joined by Tim Sayle, Associate Professor of History and Director of the International Relations Program at the University of Toronto, to discuss whether Article 4 is a stepping stone to direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. Tim, thank you so much for making time for the conversation today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So most people have heard of NATO Article 5, which is, of course, an attack on one member, is an attack on all, but Poland has instead gone for the preceding one, NATO Article 4. Can you break this down for us? What exactly is Article 4?
Yes, absolutely. So Article 4 is part of the NATO treaty, and it allows any ally to request consultations, sort of like a discussion amongst all the NATO allies when that ally who's requested the consultation feels threatened. So in this case, Poland is formally asking for all of the allies to consult together about this threat to Poland.
My understanding is this is only the 8th time in NATO's history that Article 4 has been triggered. What sets, I suppose, this violation apart from other recent airspace violations? Like Romania in the past has detected Russian drones within its borders. Russian drones have crossed into Poland before. So why invoke Article 4 this time?
Right. So it seems to me that Poland views this event to be different than anything that's happened in recent memory and far more significant. And I think that has to do with the size of the number of drones that entered Polish airspace and actually how far they entered into Poland. We've seen Russia test the perimeter of NATO allies in the past, but in this case, it seems like the drones traveled a significant distance into Poland. But I think the most important element here is that it coincided with this very large attack on Ukraine. And so it seems to me that the Poles have interpreted this as either a test or a provocation from Russia that's really different than what they've seen in the past.
I'm just going to read a little bit of what Mark Carney has said. Prime Minister Mark Carney has said in response to this. He says, Canada stands with Poland and our NATO allies. We are closely coordinating with them. We will remain vigilant against Russia's attempts to widen and prolong this conflict with Ukraine. That's just a portion of the statement that he's released in response. What would be Canada's obligations then under Article 4? Is it just to, sit around a table with the rest of the allies and consult?
That's right. That's really the limit in a sort of technical sense. Canada has an ambassador or a permanent representative at NATO who sits with all of the other permanent representatives. And so at a North Atlantic Council meeting, where all the allies are represented, Canada would participate in that, very likely share Canadian views on this threat, of course, listening to what Poland has to say. So in a sense, it's not a major commitment to do anything but to talk, but it's a very symbolic obligation in that Canada and all of the NATO allies are formally consulting this threat that Poland feels. So it's more, while tangible things can come out of this, just that obligation to consult and participating that in its own right, it is a significant step.
I wonder, though, so where we are right now is Poland, has requested this consultation because it views what has happened to be a threat situation, essentially. I wonder, could this be a precursor to an Article 5 declaration? Like, do you expect any consensus to emerge from consultations that this incident could actually meet the threshold of an armed attack?
I really think that's unlikely at this point, although it's a possibility. although Article 4 and Article 5 are beside each other in the treaty and they go in order, there's not necessarily a direct link between the two. So it's possible there'll be a consensus that comes out of this Article 4 consultation, maybe a consensus for a joint statement or for NATO to take particular actions. I think it's unlikely to move quickly to Article 5, but we could imagine this being an early step in a train of events that gets there. But I think we'd have to see sort of escalation in the situation, perhaps more attacks to get to Article 5.
Could you break down for us what makes an Article 5 declaration unlikely at this point?
Yes, I think that Article 5 is a really significant step. It's only been declared once by NATO, and that was after the September 11th, 2001 terror attacks. It calls on all allies to assist the attacked party. And so that's sometimes interpreted and thought of as all states are immediately going to go to war on behalf of the attacked state. And that's not quite right. But an Article 5 declaration here would be essentially putting NATO on a war footing, suggesting that there was a real conflict with Russia in the offing. And that's quite an extreme situation. So in this case, I could imagine a whole range of steps NATO could take after Article 4 consultation before they would get to this point, calling on all allies to try and assist Poland.
What would those steps involve before reaching an Article 5 declaration?
I can imagine a whole range of steps coming out of the Article 4 consultation. I think that one of the most likely, what has happened in the past after a consultation like this, is a joint statement from NATO, really directly addressing the threat and stating that all allies stand behind or with Poland on this case. I could also imagine some planning happening in NATO. We saw when the drones entered Poland that actually a number of different NATO forces helped intercept those forces. So there could be developments along those lines as well to prepare for any future events. But mostly, I think what's important about these consultations is it's really the consultation for the Poles to make their case as to why this is a threat and for them to get a sense of what the other allies think, because NATO runs on consensus. It's very important for the allies all to be on the same page about what steps they can take next.
And just to be very clear, to reach a consensus on Article 5, as you mentioned there, every member would need to be in agreement. It's not like it's a majority.
Right. There's no majority rules. It's a consensus-based alliance. NATO is very proud of that, but that does make things a little bit complicated in such a large alliance.
So if, a direct military reaction from NATO is not expected, as you've just laid out, the question then is, how do NATO allies, especially the U.S. is what I'm thinking of here, respond without escalating military tensions?
Well, I think one of the major variables here is just whether and how the United States is interested in responding to this situation at all. I think that's why these consultations are so important. And I'm sure what all of the allies are watching for is to see what instructions the U.S. ambassador has for these consultations. I expect these consultations are actually probably an effort to try and suss out the American position and see how much support there actually is coming from the United States. It's a massive and difficult variable here.
I think, though, of the overlapping of two attacks in this week, first in the Middle East in Doha against Hamas leadership, and now this attack on Ukraine that included the violation of Polish airspace. I think that presents a pretty special challenge for the U.S. Would you agree? Like, how would that increase pressure on the Trump administration to respond?
Yeah, it's an excellent point. We have these two situations in the world where if the United States does not respond or be seen to be responding, then I think it could be a signal of their abdication. It could be a signal of their abdication of responsibilities, security responsibilities in two important parts of the world for U.S. interests. So it's possible that the United States will join with all of the other allies in finding a consensus about issuing a strong statement condemning these attacks and warning the Russians about these drone incursions happening again. That's a real possibility here, but it's not certain.
Do you see this at all going further than a statement, though? Like, without direct confrontation, is there still leverage that the Europeans and Americans have, at least perhaps on the economic level, when we think of sanctions or, frozen assets, that sort of thing?
I think you're right that any response here is probably going to be in the political and possibly the economic realm. It's very difficult to see how there could be any sort of military response to this. And that's why the drone incursion poses such a challenge, because it is a real test of Polish defenses. Is it enough to unite all allied countries and their publics that war is imminent? I think not. And so the real challenge for the diplomats here is to figure a way of signaling to the Russians that this is unacceptable while having fairly limited tools as to how to affect that. So that's why this consultation process, again, is so important, because it's a symbol of trying to build unity at NATO and trying to show that NATO is united. This could be a case where the Russians are trying to split NATO by trying to show that NATO is not united because they can't agree on how to respond.
And I think that's something the number 2 Democrat in the Senate said on social media after this incursion into Polish airspace. He said, something to the effect of these repeated violations of NATO airspace is testing the alliance's resolve. Do you agree with that?
I think absolutely this is a test for the alliance. It's a question of whether the allies can come together and determine an effective response that they take together, and whether they can issue a credible warning that they won't stand for this. And I just don't think that's easy. I don't think it's automatic. And so there is real diplomatic work happening here, I'm sure, in Brussels to try to get the allies on the same page. Because if NATO allows this to continue without any sort of response, it will call into question the value of the alliance.
Do you think, and while I completely understand the importance of the symbolism of issuing a statement that shows that NATO allies are on the same page, do you think a written statement goes far enough, though?
I think that a statement, whether it's a written statement or a sort of speech from the Secretary General, can be crafted in a certain way to send a signal that is powerful or not powerful. And so in the past, after Article 4 consultations at the beginning of the war, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when the Secretary General spoke, he frequently he didn't invoke Article 5, but he mentioned Article 5. And so that's an important moment, because it was NATO saying that Article 5 was a part of the conversation and could be a part of the conversation. So statements can vary in their effect. We'll have to watch the wording very carefully, but often statements can be the first step in building sort of consensus and raising public awareness of an issue. So statements on their own might not do anything, but it's difficult to start at a sort of more advanced level than trying to have NATO lay out its case to its publics.
Do you see the Americans or the Europeans taking separate action as well? Like the Europeans, on one hand, they have Russian assets that are frozen in the EU. The Americans, for their part, they've already imposed secondary sanctions regarding Russian oil exports. Do you see like the U.S. extending those? Like what action possibly could the Europeans or the Americans take outside of NATO?
Right. Yeah. So I expect there'd be a sort of a political warning of some sort. There may be some strengthening of defenses, air defenses in Poland. But then the economic realm is the next place to operate. My worry here is that the allies have already gone quite far in their economic sanctions against Russia, and we've seen Russia be able to continue despite that, because they're still able to sell oil and other resources to other parts of the world who aren't willing to sanction Russia over their invasion of Ukraine. So trying to figure out a particular economic action here is difficult, but it certainly could be part of the responses that happen. The problem, of course, is whether they'll be effective with the Russian economy able to continue despite these previous sanctions.
How involved could Canada, for its part, become in the response?
Well, Canada can play a number of roles here. One, just being an active member of that consultation is very important at the diplomatic level. Then also how Canada supports the NATO statement. I don't know if Canada has a particular military role here to play, although Canada could perhaps offer contributions in terms of air policing, etc. So I think that the initial response from Canada is going to be in the public sphere, statements like those from the Prime Minister and others confirming whatever NATO says out of this, and trying to convince Canadians that of why Canada's policy is what it is. If all of the NATO allies are able to go to their own publics and explain the situation and why it's so dangerous, then NATO stands a much stronger chance of being able to really credibly convince the Russians not to do this again.
I wonder if you could just lay out for us, why it should matter to us as Canadians. Like, for instance, I think of Arctic security. Why should Canada be concerned about this?
Yeah, in this case, after the attacks on Poland, the Polish leader has said that this is the closest Poland has been to war since the Second World War. It's clear that one of Canada's treaty allies, Poland, feels under threat. There is a real chance of an escalation of this war beyond Ukraine to include Canada's treaty allies. And so there's those sort of legal and diplomatic obligation for Canada to assist a state that's being attacked. But more than that legal obligation, Canadians in the 20th century saw general war break out in Europe twice in the First and Second World War, and those wars had tremendous impacts on Canada. There's no reason to think that Canada would be able to stand back and watch an expanding general war in Europe without it having direct implications on our quality of life, but also just our safety and security here in Canada. So war in Europe is a real concern for all Canadians.
Just to pick up on that note, like, while Canada, and it's done so again, has underscored the importance of what it calls its steadfast support for Ukraine, how far should we go in protecting Poland and the Baltic nations?
So Canada has made a commitment to these allies and all the allies in the same way these allies have made a commitment to Canada. So there is, a very clear legal obligation, this treaty that Canada belongs to, and Canada has been committed to NATO, since its origins in 1949. So for Canada to be able to play a role or determine just how to live up to that obligation, I think that's a real responsibility of Canada's political leaders to explain this to Canadians, to explain why Canada has made these commitments and why it's important to live up to them. So the commitments are already there. They've already been made. And now there's a challenge to remind Canadians of that. And also, I think, on the government to really demonstrate to Canadians just how and why it's important for Canada to live up to those obligations.
Russia, for its part, says, it's absolutely not interested in any escalation with Poland. Accident or not, what does Russia gain from this?
I think Russia gains quite a bit from this. I know there has been some statements, I think, out of Belarus that this was an accident. I was immediately skeptical.
Without evidence.
Right, that's right. It seems difficult for me to fly a number of drones into another country by accident, but I expect this was likely purposeful, and Russia gains in at least two areas that I can think of. The first is it does provide a real test of Polish and other NATO air defenses in Poland. So, Russian sensors are able to observe and watch just what Poland, the Polish Air Force, the Dutch Air Force, Italian air defense teams were able to do in an incursion. So they gain a lot of military intelligence as a result of an attack like this. But second, as we were speaking about earlier, it creates a real problem for NATO and in NATO, because now some cases where maybe the NATO allies were maybe papering over some differences about just what the threat situation was in the area now have to face that. And so NATO could emerge from this stronger and unified, but I'm assuming the Russian bet here is at very limited cost, no loss of life for the Russians, just simply sending in drones. They're really able to stir up a hornet's nest in NATO, and maybe they'll be able to surface some real differences in the alliance. So they gain a lot here with very little cost.
Spell it out for us. Why do you think Russia is betting that this will lead to fractures in the alliance?
I think that Russia is hoping to split the allies between those who are really deeply committed to supporting Ukraine in the war against Russia, who really think that's an existential threat for their country. And a great example, of course, is Poland, right on the border with Ukraine. And other NATO allies who are maybe not so sure that they want to or are able to live up to their commitments to try and deter Russia. I think that for many years, NATO was able to portray a really unified front against Russia in this war with Ukraine. And I wonder if the Russians see an opportunity here to either create fractures within Europe or really to test out just how the Americans will respond to a provocation like this, because it is uncertain to me just what the United States will do when one of their major allies asks them to consult on a threat to their country.
Do you think it at all strengthens Russia's position, just given the recent diplomatic efforts to end this war in Ukraine?
I think it could. If there is division in NATO and NATO takes a weak position after these incursions, I think it would undermine any idea that Europe would be able to backstop Ukraine after some sort of peace negotiation with European troops there. I think it might convince the Ukrainians, if NATO doesn't react firmly, it could convince the Ukrainians that their supporters are less stalwart than they had hoped, and that could play into their calculations about how to move forward. So there are a number of different ways that this could go.
I guess, where do we go from here? Like, I know you say that a declaration of Article 5 is unlikely, at least right now, but as you mentioned earlier, it could also be the first step in possibly getting there. Like, should we be concerned about a World War III? What happens now?
I think we should be worried about where this goes, but there is a very viable and quite possible way forward here that doesn't move towards any sort of escalation. And that would be if NATO is able to take a really firm position, both publicly with a statement that none of the allies will stand for incursions like this into Polish airspace. And in the past, there's reporting that the United States has made important telephone calls to Russian officials to explain precisely what would happen if Russia were to take violent actions, in this case against a NATO member. So that there is a possibility that NATO can react in a way that makes clear to the Russians that it's disadvantageous to Russia to do things like this.
But why hasn't that worked already?
Well, I actually think that this war, the invasion, began in 2022, and for years, NATO allies have been supplying weapons to Ukraine, supplying money to Ukraine, and those weapons have transited through NATO states on the Ukrainian border, and they have not been interdicted by the Russians. So NATO allies have been able to support Ukraine in a way that the Russians have not chosen to interdict that because it would call into question Article 5 and NATO's commitment to its own allies' security. So in a sense, I think that NATO has fairly effectively deterred Russia from testing Poland, but it's clear that they're willing to try now to test just what will happen if they do take things a little bit further.
Okay. Tim Sayle, I will leave it on that note. Thank you so much for your insight. Really appreciate you making time for the conversation.
Thanks for chatting.
That was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Caryn Ceolin. Thanks for listening.